Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the fourth day of Squatchmas. Now, tonight's Squatchmas journey is going to take us into the Colorado Rockies. So get your snackage and grab a place over there by the tree. Let's get this night of Squatchmas joy rolling. Most people interested in the topic of Sasquatch have heard the Sierra sounds that Ron Moorhead recorded. If you haven't, you should look them up. Listen to them with headphones on or earbuds in, and close your eyes while you listen. Those sounds are not like anything else on Earth, and that's been backed up and proven by science. My personal rule is, don't go into the mountains alone. I've had this rule since 1988, and you'll soon hear about that. The one other time I broke my personal rule, well, let's just say it was a rough night. It was in the Sierras. While alone there, I heard some very strange calls late at night while camped in Yosemite. These were not exactly like what Moorhead recorded, but they were wild enough that they made me get out of my tent, sit up, and listen with a gun on my lap until dawn came. Whatever was making those calls around my camp area was very close, although I saw nothing that night. It's fair to say I was happy to leave that place come dawn. I have never returned to that area. If anyone is interested, I was on the northern end of McGurk Meadow, camped between the Meadow Brook and Bridal Veil Creek. But that night of staring into the darkness around me, that's not the one I want to share with you. I was on guard so much that night because of what had happened years before, and that's what I want to share with you. I got married in late August 1987. For our honeymoon, my wife's uncle offered to let us stay in his cabin. It was up on Cow Mountain in the Colorado Rockies. We did not intend to stay through the winter, but things in our lives changed unexpectedly. Like I found out I no longer had a job to go back to in Denver. That's another story, and it really turned out for the best. But her uncle offered for us to stay through the winter, and he helped us get everything ready. He used to winter over there in that cabin himself for many years. He worked construction half the year, and when that work dried up for the season, he went up and wintered over there. But now he was older, and his second wife was not a fan of staying up there, and she was even less of a fan of him staying up there without her. So he kindly offered to let us stay and take care of the cabin. It was a good offer, and we jumped on it. Looking back, those were some halcyon days for us. It was wonderful. We were young. We were in love. We did all the things that people today are crying that we need to get back to doing. I spent all of September and most of October putting up as much extra wood as possible. We spent several afternoons in Colorado Springs, spending most of the money we had gotten from our wedding, buying what we needed to stay the winter in the cabin. We were thrifty, frugal, resourceful. We were all the things that everyone now makes little 1-minute videos about today. She made bread. Oh, could she make bread? I split wood. We had blisters, but we were smiling. We were healthy and fit. I know I've never been any fitter than that time. So there we were. Autumn came and went. We got into the deep winter of January and February. We were still doing all right. The wood for the stove and the oil for the heating were holding out just fine. But there's no way 2 people can stay cooped up in a tiny cabin without a little bit of fighting. I don't care how much you love each other. Me, I was an egghead, and I said something about her cooking one day, which really wasn't fair of me. She was getting pretty good at cooking on that wood stove, and there had been a big learning curve. And me? I wasn't doing any of the cooking, so I don't know who I thought I was to complain. Well, my comment got me a plate of food thrown at me. I thought that was a bit of an overreaction. And let's just say, things went downhill from there and got pretty heated. There was still snow outside, but just a few inches. It had fallen a few days before. I decided a walk was the best way to wind down this fight. I'd go out, clear my head and my lungs, and then come back, and she'd be in a better mood, right? It would all blow over, right? That's what I thought anyway. I was young, and I still didn't know how fights in a marriage worked. I used to wait for things to blow over. Now I know that doesn't work out well. But we're talking about young me in February of 1988, the stupid version of me. Now this happened about 4 p.m. as I recall it, maybe 3. I left the cabin and she was calling me everything but a human being. If I had been a bird in a tree watching and listening, I would have probably thought it quite funny the way she was throwing things after me that landed in the snow. And Lord Almighty, that woman had a set of lungs on her. I loved walking around up there. I never went really far because I knew I'd be climbing up to the top of the mountain or trespassing on someone's land. But I had an area that I walked up and around, and I would crisscross side to side and go back up and go back over, and then I would walk back down the same path, and then I'd do it all over again. I did that route maybe 2 times. And up at the top end of it, I noticed the temperature had dropped quite suddenly. I was now seeing my own breath. The snow had begun to fall. I was so busy walking around fuming and thinking of all the snappy comebacks I should have said in that fight that I hadn't noticed. I was not dressed for this kind of weather. When I left that afternoon, I was in a button-up flannel shirt and a thermal shirt underneath. I had on jeans and my boots. No hat, no gloves, no jacket. It had felt like it was in the mid-40s when I left, and then all of a sudden it felt like it was now in the low 20s, maybe dipping into the teens. I was suddenly shivering. Whether I was mad or not, I had to go back to the cabin. I turned around, and the snow was getting thicker, the flakes bigger, and it was falling faster. In just a few minutes, it was filling in my previous steps. I was cold and shivering, and I still had maybe 10 or 12 minutes to get within sight of the cabin. I stumbled and tried to catch myself on a spruce limb, but it was just out of reach. Thankfully, I went down on my back and not face forward. I was on an inclined area, so I rolled over in the snow to push myself up with my arms. That seemed safer than balancing forward to get up. That might not make sense, but believe me, it makes sense when you're on the snow on an incline on a mountain. I roll over. I push myself up to standing, so I'm now facing the way I had just come from, and I was thunderstruck. Everything was now covered in a white blanket of snow. It was sticking to the firs and the pines all around. It was coming down thick and very fast. Everything was white everywhere I looked, even the tree trunks. Anything facing the wind with the snow was now covered white. The snow was sticking to everything, except for the Sasquatch. And let's be real here. I don't know how anyone can see one of these things and not know exactly what it is. They've been all over the news and the media for the last 60 years or more. I never had a mountain of doubt at all when I looked at it. That thing stuck out with its black fur in that white, snowy landscape. Snow was beginning to stick to it, but the black fur was the darkest thing on the landscape. Its height was in the 9-foot-plus range. Maybe it could have looked taller because it was standing above me, but I don't think so. I worked at a lumber stockyard in Denver for a few years, and I could tell you an 8-foot from a 9-foot from a 10-foot board at a long distance, even when they were laying down. I didn't need to look at the tag or the stamp. You do that all day for a few years, you get very good on knowing exactly what height and measurements look like, even from a distance. I wish I could tell you I was thinking all kinds of brilliant things, or maybe things like, how long had that been there? Was it following me? If so, for how long? Or something wonderful. Maybe I should have been thinking like, should I try to communicate with it? But nope. Oh no. Young me in 1988? Nope. The only thing I remember in my head when I saw it was, oh bleep, oh bleep, oh bleep. And it just ran on a loop in my head without another real thought. The distance between us was not enough to my liking. I'd say it was the length of my house now, which is 30 by 50, flat ranch. So I'm going to guess it was about 50 feet away from me. It wasn't making any move toward me at all. It was standing there, staring holes right through my eye sockets. I remember watching the snow stick to the fur on its face. At that distance, I could really only take in its height and overall silhouette. It was big, not just tall, but it doesn't seem right to say that it was wide. It was thick and muscled. Its shoulders were the widest point on it, and the chest had a rounded look to it, not flat pecs like a human has, but they weren't as round of a chest like a gorilla either. It was somewhere in between. I froze up and almost didn't respond when I saw it take a step closer to me. It never looked away from me. Suddenly I made myself move, and I was scrambling backwards down, but I would not turn my back on it. It was advancing right straight to me. It got to within about 10 feet, and I said, "Oh no," and I turned and I ran. I ran through the snow like my butt was on fire, knowing running could have been the worst thing I could do if it was a predator animal, but at that point I didn't want it getting any closer. But every time I looked back, it was right there. I was running and stumbling, and it was coming through the snow as easily as we would walk down a sidewalk, with no effort at all. I was running, but it was not. It was walking with what I would call a determined stride. Even while this was happening, I knew, no matter what I did, I would never be able to outrun it. If it wanted me, it was going to get me. Once or twice I almost ran into trees while running because I kept looking behind me more than I was looking ahead. Every time it took a step, I heard the snow crunch, and I heard a strange escape of air from its chest. Not like a growl, but like a whisper of a grunt, or maybe a whispered grunt. It was loud enough I heard it over my own breathing, my heartbeat that was echoing in my skull, and my own running footsteps. It moved on the snow like it had snowshoes on, which we know it didn't. But moving through the snow, that was no effort for that Bigfoot. I was so scared and running so hard, my heart almost beat itself out of my chest. When I broke through to the clearing around the cabin, I was making harsh sounds as I breathed. My wife said I sounded like a seal barking. She was looking out the windows because the snow had been coming down fast, and I had not come back. She was worried. She saw me come through the trees, and she immediately opened the door for me. And then she saw what was right behind me. My wife let out a scream. I kept my eyes focused on her and the cabin door, and I kept running. I ran into the cabin, and I just kept going. I went to the back bedroom. I didn't even shut the cabin door. That wasn't a decision that I made. My body was just running, and it did nothing else. I got into the bedroom, and I was momentarily confused, because there was nowhere else to run, and I had to stop. I turned around, and my wife was right behind me. She slammed the bedroom door shut, and then started pushing the dresser against the door. She was yelling at me to help, and I finally did. There was a bit of a commotion out there in the front room, but we were too scared to look. We waited several minutes, then it got quiet, and nothing happened. Nothing pressed on the door. I whispered to my wife, "Did you close the cabin door?" She looked at me in surprise and she said no, she couldn't. She was going to, but it was right there, right at the door. She was too afraid to go near the door. She said it was close enough it could have reached in and got her. After that, it was very hard to get calm and to stay calm. We stayed on the floor there in the bedroom up against the one corner for a very long time. We didn't hear anything more. It was getting dark in the room. After more than an hour, I got brave and I cracked the bedroom door to see what the situation was out there. It was hard to tell. As I said, it was getting dark. It was probably 6:30 or 7 by that time. In the winter on the mountain, that time is as dark night. The wood fire out there was still going in the stove, but it was down low. Thankfully, that stove had a glass front door, so there was a little light out there. My wife had also had a lamp on in the kitchen before I came back to the cabin, so there was that light too. But none of that light felt like enough. I cracked the door, wincing every time the dresser creaked, or when we moved it there was a scuffling sound on wood against wood. I expected something would start raging at the door as soon as it heard us. But it was quiet. I looked around, and the cabin door was now partway closed, but snow had been blowing in. But thankfully, no sign of a black Sasquatch. I braved it and opened the door a little more, but I couldn't stop the feeling that this was a trap of some kind, and it was just waiting for me to come out. But it wasn't. Eventually we got the door all the way open. First thing I did was go over to the corner and grab the rifle leaned there. It was just a .22, but a .22 rifle is better than no rifle at all. I got closer to the cabin door, and I saw what I couldn't have seen from the bedroom doorway, mostly because of furniture. There were footprints there. It had come into the cabin, and it had waited long enough before doing so that a bit of snow had blown in. Then it stepped in. The footprints were almost filled in with all the blowing snow, but their faint outline was there. It had come to just inside. Then it turned around and left. The only thing we noticed was the bread that my wife had baked that afternoon that was sitting at the end of the counter cooling was gone. It had been rising in the pan when we had the fight, and she baked it while I was gone. It was there cooling, not far from the door. That was the only thing we saw disturbed or missing. It didn't knock anything over or take anything else. The bread just happened to be there, I guess. Just a quick victory or spoil of the war. Cautiously, we worked our way around the cabin and turned on more lights. We got the snow brushed out and the door closed up. The snow was still falling like crazy out there. But even then, there were still faint footprints all over around the front of the cabin, though they were quickly disappearing with the snow. We did not have a phone there in the cabin, but there was a CB radio. It wasn't strong enough to reach all the way to Colorado Springs, but her uncle used it mostly to talk to the other neighbors. I called out and I asked if anyone had had any trouble in the snow today. It was an insane, crazy urge that I had to ask the neighbors, but I didn't quite know how to ask if anyone had seen a Sasquatch. The two halting replies I got were that everything was good on their end. Was I having some trouble up there? Was I out of wood? Food? Was there an emergency? I hesitated. How did I say I had been chased by a Sasquatch and it had come into my cabin? I couldn't say that, even though it was the truth. I ended up saying that I heard something out there in the snow. Might have been a deer or an elk or some large animal. I said it sounded wounded, so I told them to be careful if they walked outside. I felt foolish saying that, and I could tell by their pauses they were thinking I was crazy. But I signed off, and I left it at that. Those people had been living up there, some of them for years and decades. I had just been there a few months. Who was I to tell them anything about anything? Maybe they all knew about the Sasquatches. Maybe her uncle knew and he just neglected to tell us. I still have not worked out the logistics of how that Sasquatch got through the cabin door. The cabin door was standard, and the cabin inside only had an 8-foot ceiling. But thinking on it, maybe it did step in, hunched over, and it realized it wasn't a good fit. Maybe that's why it didn't come in further. If it had wanted me, it would have had me in the snow. I never would have made it to the cabin. If it had wanted to get to us in the bedroom, it could have, even stooped over inside the cabin. That thin door and a mere dresser up against it couldn't have stopped it. Sometimes I think they do things just for their own amusement or curiosity. I think some of them like running us, the way kids like to run after rabbits. The snow continued to fall all through the night. We kept a vigil and a watch way until the early morning hours, but nothing happened. The strangest thing, though, was that a very heavy fog moved in over the snow that night. It was both beautiful and frightening at the same time, because our visibility was very limited. We stayed at that cabin through till midsummer, believe it or not. There were times when I was out splitting wood or doing other work outside that I felt like I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. But try as I might, I never saw anything. There were sounds at night that we couldn't pin on anything we knew, and there were things that disappeared around the cabin. I learned never leave anything outside, no matter how small. Even though her uncle said he had never left anything out there, nothing had ever walked away. No one ever came up there to take anything. It was funny how often our things went missing. I never took walks again that far up the mountain either. I did enjoy my time there, even after that whole Sasquatch incident. And I don't know what I did to get that Sasquatch's attention. I often wonder what might have happened or not happened if I had not turned to see that he was there. When I think about what I saw, I just have a fast vision of black fur, snow, cold, running and breathing hard. I see flashes of the body height and the shape. I see flashes of something I don't want to look at. The memory of the Sasquatch is vague and yet sharp. It's so sharp that I don't want to bring up the memory of what it looked like. This might not be the best story for Squatchmas, since it wasn't happening at Christmas time. But the snow and the winter in the Rockies, I thought that might make it good for Squatchmas. Use it as you see fit. Thanks, CJ. P.S. That marriage did not last, but it was good while it lasted. As for what I heard that night on McGurk's Meadow, all I can say is something about what I was hearing kept ringing bells in my head. It was like a déjà vu, but more like a real memory as well, a real memory from something in the Rockies. All night I was thinking about that black Sasquatch, and I saw the memory I don't like to think about everywhere out there in the darkness on the meadow. My advice: don't go into the mountains alone. You're a fool if you do. I've done it twice, and, well, twice you know what happened. While Sasquatch is not the most likely thing you will run into, it's never a 0% chance. Don't go into the mountains alone. That's my advice. Thanks, CJ. Wow, thank you, CJ, for that. And, I did think it was a good one for Squatchmas. Sometimes I pick stories for Squatchmas based more on how engrossing the story is, rather than how much it's tied to Christmas. I know part of the fun of Squatchmas is getting engrossed in a good story, so I try to save a lot of stories for that. So yeah, I saved this one for Squatchmas. All right, everyone. Well, that's an end to the 4th day of Squatchmas. As you know, we'll be meeting up again tomorrow. And until then, always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.